There's a lot of code in your applications that you didn't write. For example, if you're building a Windows application, there's a lot of code in the system.windows.forms namespace that you use to create controls on the form. You didn't write that code. If you're doing ADO.NET, you're using code in the system.data namespace, and you didn't write that code. That code lives in an assembly, whether it's system.windows.forms.dll or system.data.dll. All of the .NET Framework code is in external assemblies. And then there are external assemblies that you did write. So in an earlier section, we saw an application that called code in the time library assembly, and that's a class library that we wrote that has a class that returns the time. So to call code that's in an external component or an assembly, you have to have a reference to it. And you'll use the Add References dialog to add a reference. And this dialog gives you a number of tabs, one of which shows all of the installed .NET classes, so everything in the .NET Framework, and also other .NET classes on your computer. You can use the Add References dialog to add a reference to a class library project that's in your solution. So sometimes you'll split up the code in a solution into multiple projects, and they're all in the solution. And of course, you can add a reference to a class library project that's not in this solution. For example, it might be in a separate solution. And in that case, you'd go browse for and find the DLL file that represents that assembly. And by using the References path page, you can instruct the Add References dialog to look in a particular folder for assemblies that you want to add a reference to. So let's go take a look at adding references in projects. And when I click the Get the Day and Time button, I'm going to get the day and time. And I'm going to use the TimeTeller class, which has methods for getTime and getDate. This TimeTeller class doesn't live inside this project, it's actually in the Time Library namespace. And so it's in a separate project. What I had to do then is add a reference to it. And in the Solution Explorer, if I expand the References node, I see that I currently do have a reference to Time Library. Let me remove this, and then we'll re-add it. Because of course at this point, this line of code won't compile. So what I would do to add a reference is either select Project, Add Reference, or I can right-click on the project and add a reference, and that brings up the Add References dialog. And the .NET tab of the Add Reference dialog shows me .NET classes. If I scroll down to System, here are the .NET Framework classes. There are a number of other ones in here. These aren't necessarily every single .NET class on my computer. So for example, Time Library is not in here. But the Add Reference dialog has a list of places it'll look for .NET classes, and those appear in the .NET tab. If I want to add a reference to a COM component, I can do that from here. If Time Library was a class library project in this solution, then I could directly add a reference to it here, but it's not part of the solution, so I have to go look for it. So I'll go to the Browse tab and then navigate to the output folder for Time Library, and then I can select it here. And now I have a reference to this, and now this code will compile. And I also get the visual cue. TimeTeller now changes color. Let's do that again. Let's remove this. And notice that TimeTeller is now in all black, which is a little visual indication that the compiler doesn't know what TimeTeller is. Now when I add a reference to this, and because I added a reference to it previously, I can go to the Recent tab of the Add Reference dialog and add a reference to it. And now TimeTeller changes color, and that tells me that the compiler understands what it is. Now when I use it, I have two choices. I can explicitly say the TimeTeller class in the Time Library namespace, or if I remove that, of course I now get an error. So I have an option to either go back to explicitly saying Time Library.TimeTeller or adding a using statement at the top of the file. So now I'm using time library, and these using statements will tell the compiler likely spots for a class that it doesn't recognize. So the compiler knows that timeteller is not in this project, so it will then look through each of the namespaces that I've added using statements for, and when it gets to time library, it finds the timeteller class and changes the color, and now this code will compile. Well, let's say I want to use this timeteller class in every single application I ever build. Well, now I'm going to have to add a reference to it in every application. That's okay. But I don't really feel like having to browse for it over and over again, and it may or may not have been added recently. What I really want is for it to appear in the .NET tab. And the way I can do that for this project is by going into the project properties, going to the reference paths page, and adding a path. Let's remove this one. I created this one when I was building this project. We don't actually have this folder on this computer, so I'll remove it. Let's add a folder as a reference path. So what I'm going to do is navigate to the location of this time library assembly and add this as a reference path. So I could do this if I wanted to add this time library reference to every project, or maybe a more realistic scenario is that I have on my computer a folder that contains .NET assemblies I'm going to use over and over again. So I add that folder as a reference path, and now for this project, let's remove time library and re-add it. Now if I go back into the add reference dialog, time library appears in the .NET tab. There it is. Because by setting a reference path, I've told the add reference dialog also look in this folder. It's a nice time-saving thing. I can select a folder, and then all of the .NET assemblies in that folder appear in the add references dialog. That folder could be on my machine, could be a shared folder on the network. In your projects, in addition to code, you're going to have resources. And you can manage the resources you use in a project on the resources page of the project designer. And what are the resources in a project? Well, they're strings, they're images, icons, audio files, text files, XML files, etc. And you want to organize and manage these by creating resources. There are two types of resources in a project: local or project level resources. Local resources are associated with the form, for example, that uses them. So you can decide you want to display an image and a button on the form and make that a local resource, and then it basically belongs to the form. If you add that form to another project, the resource travels with it because the resource is stored in an RESX file associated with that form. You can also have project-level resources, and the benefit of a project-level resource is that it can be used anywhere in the project. So not only on a single form, but on multiple forms. And those resources are going to be stored in the resources.resx file. So anytime you add a resource to a project, whether it's local or project level, Visual Studio makes a copy of that file and puts it into the project in either the forms resource file or the project resource file. And it's therefore very easy to share resources across projects, because all you have to do is copy the RESX file into the new project. So if you're using a local resource, this happens automatically. I create a new project and I add an existing item and I point to a form I created somewhere else. When I add that form to the project, the form's RESX file comes with it. If I want to reuse project level resources in a new project, then I just copy the resources.resx file into the new project, and then all of those resources are available. And once I've added a resource to a project, it can be easily referenced in code. So let's go see how to work with project resources. Here's the main form of the project settings application. And on this button here, the Change the Image button, I have both text and an image. And I do that by setting the text to change the image and then when I wanted to select the image, I came to the image property and I clicked the ellipsis here, and now I have two ways I can add images. Well, images are resources, and I can use either a project resource or a local resource. Well, the project currently has 5 resources: the checkmark, the globe, help, no action, and save. So I chose no action. If I wanted to change this to globe or checkmark, then I just select those, and when I click OK, that changes. If I want to add additional project resources, there are 2 ways I can do that. I can click Import here, and then navigate to a folder that has images, select one, and open it, and that adds it to the project. So let's set this back to no action, which is what it was. And now let's go into the Solution Explorer and go into the project properties and go to the Resources tab, and here are the resources in the project. Now, resources are not only images, but they're also strings, icons, audio, files such as XML, etc., a number of things. So if I want to add a resource, I can actually create new ones, so I could draw a new image if I had any design talent, or I can go add an existing file. And once again, I'll navigate to a folder that has images, and then I can select an image and add it as a resource into the application. If I then decide that I don't want any of these, I can select them and remove them. And here are my resources. They're stored in the resources folder of the project. They're also stored in this resources.resx folder. Now notice that when I deleted those resources, they weren't literally deleted from the resources folder. They're just deleted from the resources.resx folder. And so if I go to add these back, and I go to the images folder, so if I add this JPEG back, Visual Studio tells me there's already a file with that name. Do I want to replace it? And that's because Visual Studio created a copy of that and put it in the resources folder on the disk. So if I want to add it to the resources, then Visual Studio will create a copy of it and put it in resources. And then again, if I want to remove this, I can remove it from the resources folder as well. So these are the 5 resources that I want to be able to use on buttons in my application. And so, again, when I wanted to add an image to this button, I can select from any project resource. Well, I might want to add a local resource, and a local resource in this case would be tied to the switchboard form, not at the project level. If I want to do that, I'll click Local Resource, and then click Import. And now once again, I'll go to a folder that has images, select a resource, select an image, click Open, and now this button displays that image. But notice that that image has not been added to the Resources folder, and if I go back into Project Settings, it's not a project level resource. Where is it? It's actually stored in the switchboard.resx file. If I double click on that, here are the resources associated with this form. And because this resource is associated with the form, if I add this form to a different project, that resource file will go with it. Or if I copy this solution to another computer, the resource moves with it. So let's create a second form. And on this form, let's add a button. And let's set an image for that button. If I now click Image, I don't have access to that AppDev logo. All I have access to are the project resources. So I could add this as a resource to this form again, but I guess that's a little duplicative. At this point, I probably want to add it as a project resource, and then it's available everywhere in the project. Okay, let's get rid of this form. We don't actually need it. Now let's look at how we can work with resources at runtime. And I don't need to set this back because I'm going to change the image at runtime. So let's run this application. And now I decide I don't want this image anymore. I click change the image and it changes to the check mark. Well, let's see how we did that. It's really a simple single line of code. I set the image property of the image button to properties.resources.checkmark, which says set it to this file here. I don't need to know that it's a .bmp versus a .jpg. I don't really need to know where it came from. Because it's a project level resource, I can reference it as a property of resources. So if I type properties.resources. There's checkmark, globe, no action, save, and help. So all of the resources show up as properties of this resources collection, which is a collection of resources in the project, and therefore I can reference any of these anywhere in the project with a single line of code. You can use the settings page of the Project Designer to manage application or user properties, and these can be accessed at runtime. So you can use settings instead of constants, because a constant is defined in code, whereas a setting is defined at the project level, and therefore can be managed at the project level in the Project Designer. Now there are two types of settings. Application level settings are read-only at runtime, and this would be a good place to store things like database connections. And in fact, when you create a data source in Visual Studio, Visual Studio creates an application level setting for the connection string. User level settings are associated with the current user and can not only be read at runtime, but they can also be changed. So here you could store user preferences for things like fonts, colors, textual messages, and the settings are stored in the user's folder on the computer. And then once you've added a setting to a project, you can easily reference it in code. So let's go see how to use settings in an application. I have the project settings project open in Visual Studio. Let's go see how we work with settings. So if I come into the Project Designer and I go to the settings page, here is where I set application level properties. And those properties can either be associated with the users or with the application. So to add a new setting, I can click in a new row and let's create a setting. So I'll create a setting called AppDevCity. I then select the data type, any of the built-in ones, color, font, etc. I'll just leave it a string. I'm going to set this at the application level because I'm not going to change it at runtime, and I'll set it to Eden Prairie. Another use for application level settings is database connections. So I might create a setting called connection string and then select that it's a connection string. It's automatically set to an application level property, and now when I click this ellipsis, I'd get the connection properties dialog and I could connect to a database and store the connection string in the project. And in fact, Visual Studio does that. When you create a data source in your project, Visual Studio stores the connection string as a setting. In this project, I have 3 user level settings. One for title, which is a string, which defaults to project settings in Visual Studio 2008, and then a form color and a form font. When I created the form color, I selected that it was of type system.drawing.color, and when I did that and I set the value, I could select it from the color picker. For font, I selected that it was of type system.drawing.font, and then when I set the value, I got the font dialog. these are the 3 user level settings, and these are the default values for the properties. Now where are these stored? They're actually stored in the app.config file. So if we open this, here are the user settings, title, form color, form font, and then here's the application level setting. So now the runtime can easily tell which of these properties can be changed at runtime and which can't. Okay, let's use these settings in the form. These 2 buttons down here, change the text and change color and font, are going to go retrieve the text setting in the first button and the form color and form font setting in the second button and update the form. So let's run this. And when I click change the text, notice that the text in the title bar changes to Project Settings in Visual Studio 2008. And if I click change color and font, the color gets set to that light cyan and the font gets set to the Verdana 9.75. So let's see the code to do that. And because these are application level settings, I can easily reference them in code. Settings are stored in the settings class, which belongs in the namespace projectsettings.properties, so I can create a new instance of that class, and then each of the settings is a property on that. So I can type project settings dot, here's AppDevCity, here's the form color and the form font, and here's the title. So I can reference settings as properties of this project settings class, and then I just set the text property of the form to the title. To change the color and the font, I set the back color of the form to the value of the form color setting, and I set the font property of the form to the value of the form font setting. Now back color is of type color, and so is form color. Font is of type font, so is form font, and I define them that way. This is color, this is font, and therefore I don't have to do any casting at runtime. I can just set the back color and the font to the values of those settings. 1 line of code to get a reference to the settings, and then 1 line of code to use each setting. The next thing I want to do is give the user the ability to set preferences. So I want the user to choose what they want as the form color. I'll choose khaki and click change color setting, and I also want the user to choose what they want to use as the form font. I'll select Arial and change font setting. And now, when I change the color and the font, I'm not going to set the form to light cyan and Verdana 9.75, which is the application's font. I'm going to set it to what the user selected, khaki and Arial. Let's go see that. When I click the Change Color Setting button, I ran this code. Again, I got a reference to the settings, and then I set the form color setting to either slate gray, light blue, or khaki based on what the user selected. And then I save the settings by calling projectsettings.save. Similarly, when I click the Change Font Setting button, I set the form font setting to either sans serif, Verdana, or Arial based on what the user selected, and then again save those settings. So I've now, for this user, changed the form color and the form font setting. If I go back into the Project Designer, notice that these settings haven't changed because these are the default values for the application. Those user settings are actually stored in the user-specific folder on the computer. So you as the developer will set the default values in the project in the settings page, and then users will have the ability to overwrite those, and those get stored locally. So multiple users on the same computer could have different settings, or more likely, you send out the project with default settings, and then each user can change their settings as they like. So settings are project-level properties. Application settings are read-only at runtime, but user settings can be not only read, but modified. And that gives you the ability to reuse these and give the users the ability to set preferences.